an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Unspoiled, covering the Wall of Storms. Chapters 55 and 56, The Silkmotic Force and the Prince's Flight. In these chapters, Firo stumbles upon electricity due to a street performer doing magic. Who knew? And Prince Timu is basically raped. Welcome to Unspoiled. Nope. Spoil me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. Kyle, I hate you, though. Guys, I'm going to start with the second of the two chapters in this section because I just got to talk about Prince Timu. It's just... man. Oh, did I hate that? I hated it so much. Y'all... there is so much about this that I respect about how it was written. Ken Liu does not get graphic. And to be honest, this moment is often of a female victim. So the fact that he has it be a male victim instead is kind of, I think, a really admirable way to handle it. Because this is one of those things that a lot of men's rights activists will behave as if, like, women don't like to admit that men can be raped. And the thing is that they don't actually care about male victims of rape. They just want to one-up women, or else they would realize... women absolutely care that men can be raped. And the fact that we don't take that seriously is a product of patriarchy. Men are just as much victims of patriarchy as women are a lot of the time. And violence, especially sexual violence against women, is such a fucking plot point for so many writers. And it's... in some ways, I can understand it because so many women do experience it, that if you were to not address it at all and you're trying to build a world that feels real, it's going to feel like avoidance. But there are ways to reference it without, without feeling as if it's being done for shock value, as if it's without being exploitative. There are some writers who will write a scene about a sexual assault and it will feel almost gleeful, or like the writer was like low-key getting off on it a little bit. You can feel it when you're reading it when it's something like that. I'm looking at you, Stephen King. Hi. And I really like the fact that I do not remember... and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Kyle. Kyle says, I'm sorry, I can't even reread this chapter. Yeah. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember a scene depicting sexual violence with a woman. If I'm mistaken, please correct me. It's not that Ken Liu doesn't write about women being raped, because that is included as part of the narrative. We know it happens, and we know that it is like... something that women in this world are afraid of. I mean, we have the whole thing with like the ways in which Peku Tenryo made it. Peku Tenryo, I got that reversed. Basically made the women of his community like submit in this way. So it's not that it doesn't happen, But having it be a scene this personal, it hasn't, as far as I can remember. And I think I would remember. And this is so... God, I'm getting really like... He wrote it really well in that the situation is from Timu's point of view, his own fault. That, I think, is the cruelest part of patriarchy and rape culture, is that it makes the person who was taken advantage of and victimized, set up, it makes them second guess themselves for the rest of their lives and wonder if they should have done something different, if they had more control over the situation than they thought they did at the time. Was there a way to get out of this? I don't know that there was. You know, I'm reading it and thinking, Timu, don't drink it. I'm thinking, Timu, don't fall for this. But I can't say with any confidence that Timu doesn't get drugged at some other point if he doesn't drink this now. They give him a drug. She says, do you want to? And he says, I do, but... And then says, no, please don't stop. And she doesn't. And he still thinks later on about the fact that he said initially, I do, but, and believes that, like, having said that, basically it's his fault and he let all of his people down. And the way that this goes is basically like the fact that they slept together. Now he's going to marry her, if I'm not mistaken, is the way that this sort of like wraps up. And I absolutely cannot handle that being like, She spoke to him of the wedding plans, a simple affair that would combine Liuku and Dara elements, of the eventual coronation ceremony, of the need for him to think of the future, not the past. At night, she slept next to him, keeping him on the inside of the bed, and it was not clear if she did it to shield him from the draft coming from the tent opening or to prevent him from escape. She did not drug him again. Lying in the darkness, Timu replayed the events of the day of the Garinafin ride. He had been attracted to her. He could not deny that. He had allowed the flame of desire to drive out reason, to incinerate the words of the Anno sages, to turn the virtue he had been so carefully guarding into something bestial, something base. He had been weak, he knew. He had been at fault. His father's opinion of him had been right. Oh, guys. I feel so bad for this kid. And what kills me is that I don't know how people are going to react. And by people, I mean his family. I know how people are going to react, and they are 100% not going to believe that he was coerced. Not even a little bit. He is a man. She is attractive. He is royalty. They are going to think that he cut a deal. Of course they would. I would. I'll be perfectly honest. I would. And I just hate knowing how good-hearted he is and how much he was standing up for his people. And knowing that he is going to be depicted as somebody who put his own comfort and convenience ahead of his people, like was suggested to him at the beginning of the chapter, which he rejected. This just is, it's so upsetting for him to have all of his hard work just completely burned to the ground, essentially. He did so much and put in so much effort only to have it be torn away from him, you know? And she tells him, do not let others tell you what you should do or want. Our lives are brief flash storms in the eternal scrublands of time, and we honor all creation by living lustfully and passionately. Shame is a lie told to you by those who would enslave you rather than free you. Which, I mean, some of that is true, but you fucking raped him, so you don't really get to talk about this at all. And he turns to her, and it says she had already opened her arms to welcome him. He concentrated on his movements and the sensations coursing through his body to silence the voice of doubt, to drive out the lingering feelings of guilt. Oh man, this is not going to be pretty. Like, being reassured by your rapist that if you feel bad, that's other people's fault. That is really next level gaslighting. You know, she really has him believing that this was his choice. And I'm just so disgusted. And I really want to believe that Kuni is going to believe him when he tries to explain to him what happened. But I don't know that Timu will ever explain to him what happened. That's the thing. Men don't talk about their assaults. That's part of why it isn't really taken seriously by the world, is the men who speak openly about it are very rare, because they know that they will either not be believed or it will be implied that they should have enjoyed it. And I don't really... Timu has never been close with his dad. And I really don't know whether she, like, that is something that he would be willing to, what's the word? Entrust, really. I don't know who he would tell. I don't know that this is something that he will ever admit he didn't fully agree to. Yeah, no, when he says no, she says, I know you don't really mean that. You say one thing with your mouth, but your body thinks another. Stop lying. Let your body express the truth. And he doesn't even remember it. When he wakes up, he says, it says he wasn't sure why, but he felt as though something terrible had happened. And when he says that he has to go and meet his quota and, like, do what he has been doing, she says there will be no more quotas for you. And he says, I want to go back to the village where I was housed. Do you really? After last night, how do you think your people will see you when they learn that I've taken you to bed? I really do like you, but my father was willing to kill his friend and the Garinafin that saved his life for a better future for my people. I am my father's daughter. Timu tried to say something, anything, but nothing came to mind as he experienced a deep sense of regret and dread. And I hated this. And when she said at the beginning of this chapter, when they're talking about how they've tried to like worm their way into his head, basically, and get him to make a deal, her father expresses some admiration for Timu and says something like, I never expected him to have this much heart. And he says, we've tried practically everything. And she says, we haven't tried everything. And I suspected this was going to be it, but I thought it was going to be simple seduction. I didn't think it was going to be rape, and I sure didn't think that it was going to be rape that was like going to be framed as a legitimate relationship that would end up with marriage. I don't know if this is supposed to be like, is it supposed to be that Tanvanaki is a virgin and the fact that he took her virginity means this? I guess. I really have a hard time believing that she's a virgin because it seems like they are like, that does not really seem to hold any sort of importance in her culture. And she seems like the kind of woman that if she wants to fuck a dude, that she would have done that shit, you know, like, but that might be the way they're framing it, you know, whether she's actually a virgin is really irrelevant in the end. I don't know. And the Peku, when I'm going to back up. I'm going to back up to the beginning of the Silkmatic Force chapter, but I needed to talk about Timu off the top because I just couldn't believe what I was hearing because I was listening to the audiobook and I just felt sick, you know, and I feel so bad for Timu because he wants so bad to like do well. He cares so much about what his family and especially his father thinks of him. And for him to be used like this and made to feel that it's his own fault is just so cruel. And I just hate it so much. This really fucked me up. So, all right, let's pull back. Chapter 55. So we're with Lady Rosanna and Prince Firo. And they are going to be giving performances. Reminder that they are doing this to, Kyle says, back to fun science time. Yay. Yeah, try and get my fucking head out of that scene. Him and Lady Rosanna and some other people have been like basically putting on shows that are propaganda for the crown and are traveling around doing this in different towns and also like asking for people to pay their taxes on time and buy bonds and all this stuff. So in the downtime between these shows that they're putting on, he is wandering around in the street watching some of the street performers because this is something that he has always really enjoyed. And he's in disguise, as is the wont of the royals. And he hears somebody yelling about how this is witchcraft and you fucking, like, what do you think you're doing? My wife is pregnant. What the fuck? And he comes across this dude who is very, very spindly and thin. And he is being faced down by a really big, burly man. And it turns out that this street performer has this jar that he, like, makes bets with people and is like, if you can hold on to the lid and the base of this jar and not drop it, I will pay you X amount of money. I'll double your money. And this couple, this man and his wife, came up. The dude offered to do it. And the street performer says, oh no, I'll quadruple your money if your wife does it. And I just figured that he thought the tough guy would manage to hold it. And so he didn't want him to do it. He wanted the pregnant woman to do it. But when Firo is thinking about the tactic, what he says this guy was aiming to do was have the physically weaker of the two do it first, so that then the husband would laugh and be like, oh, maybe she couldn't do it, but I promise I can. And that way he gets even more money out of them because they're both paying to try this out. Which, that's a really smart tactic. Like, it didn't occur to me that that was how that worked, but makes sense, except he really underestimated the way that this woman would respond. And I don't know if he knew that she was pregnant or, if like, because he is aware what this thing's effects can be medically. As he talks about it later with Firo, he says something about like the ways that it can treat things like epilepsy and whatnot. So he has to be aware. If somebody is pregnant, this is not a good idea. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt in saying that he didn't know she was pregnant, that maybe she wasn't showing yet. But obviously, he just really misunderstood how this shit was going to go down. Because he thought she'd drop the jar, her husband would be like, oh, she can't, I'll do it. But she's like a little bit messed up from it and sitting on the ground and kind of like hyperventilating. And Firo sees that the jar is covered by a thin layer of silver that stopped halfway up the side. And when she says the jar bit me, it's mentioned that it's covered with some like metal sheeting. I was like looking at this in my mind's eye being like, there was something that shocked her. There was something to do with electricity. How is that possible? And we wind up finding out exactly how that's possible. Let's see. There was a cork stopper next to it, through the center of which poked a metal pin ending in a jujube-sized knob. From the bottom of the stopper dangled a chain, which was apparently supposed to rest on the inner surface of the jar when the stopper was in place. And she says that she almost passed out when it bit her. And the crowd, meanwhile, all seems to be very excited about watching this guy get his fucking ass kicked. Like, nobody is on his side, I should say. And with her kind of collapsed on the ground nearby, not seeming to be faking it at all, that's understandable. This dude picked the wrong one. So Firo tells this woman, as the constables show up, he's like, listen, there are royals in town. Everything that causes a disturbance, they're going to be extra harsh about. And you two plus this dude are going to get thrown in prison if you don't just play it cool and act like everything was this big misunderstanding. And she gets up and like manages to sort of whisper this to her husband before the constables show and gets him to calm down. And the street performer as well is just like, oh, he got a little bit carried away. It was part of the act. And the cops are finally like, all right, fine. Just don't make another scene, and tells everybody else to disperse and get out of here. So Firo goes and talks to the street magician and is like, so what the fuck is this all about? And the magician is a little bit like indebted to him, because if he had been arrested, it's likely that his equipment would have been confiscated and he would have had to pay a bunch of money in order to get it back. Like, they weren't just going to give it back. He'd have to bribe them. And so Firo sort of leans on him, and he doesn't look like a prince, but he definitely looks like somebody who's like well off and just sort of idle. And he asks about whether or not this, like if he will explain the way this all works, and has to reassure the guy, I'm not a street performer. Don't worry. I'm not taking your ideas. I'm just super curious how this could actually work. And he takes the dude out to dinner and liquors him up a little bit and gets him to explain his secrets. So this guy's name is Misa Kroon, and they begin talking about the Silkmotic force. Centuries ago, the priests of Rufizo were the first to discover that after rubbing a porcelain or glass dish with silk, the vessels attracted dust or bits of paper. Theorizing that some minute particles in the silk or silk motes had been rubbed onto the vessels or vice versa, the priests described the attractive force as the Silkmotic force. At first, the Silkmotic force was treated as a mysterious manifestation of Rufizo's universal love for humankind. Just as the lodestone's attraction for metal symbolized Fithaweo's love of warfare and weaponry, the Silkmotic force reflected Rufizo's gentler, kinder aspect. But over time, as the secret left the temples, it was the street magicians of Fasa who began to experiment with and develop this new source of crowd-pleasing effects. They fashioned elaborate apparatuses and demonstrations for the entertainment of crowds who oohed and awed over the apparently supernatural motions. So, Misa shows Firo this foot-long stage that is made out of wood and has a bunch of like paper people on it. And they are weighed down in certain areas. And they, because of the weight, but the lightness of the paper in the spots that they're not weighed down, they begin to move around. And he like initiates this by rubbing silk on this like glass rod. This is wild. Now, I gotta be honest with you guys. My understanding of electricity is so far below basic that it's embarrassing. This is I had to take a class in high school, I still remember this, where we had to like draw the parts of a circuit and explain what they each did and how a circuit worked and closed. And I still remember looking at that like diagram that I was supposed to label and feeling like I was looking at just a page written in a different language. Like, it just did not fucking resonate. And I was somebody who was pretty good at keeping things that had a sort of orderly way of working in mind. I have a pretty organized brain a lot of the time, and it just did not fucking connect for me. So I was reading this and wondering, like, how much of this is real? I assume all of it. I feel like this is something that this author probably studied, and maybe these inventions were a thing that actually existed and he didn't invent any of this, you know? But I don't know anything about the history of the discovery of electricity and how it was like first employed or created. And I mean, this guy even has like batteries. That's essentially kind of how the jar works, you know? They build up this like this charge and store it in the jars and are able to release it at will using a human being to like close the circuit once they touch it. But yeah, this is just so wild. So Firo is absolutely blown away by this. The little dancing paper people, Misa is sort of quickly like, yeah, I mean, this is cool, but it's like extremely beta. I mean, this is stuff that we did before people were able to see these actual dances in person. And soon everybody got tired of these and they just weren't really very impressive anymore. So we had to move on. So then he goes and shows Firo how they were able to like do these bigger events and stage these things involving smoke and the whole thing. So he ties these silk ropes to these beams and has Firo get up there. And he drops some of the paper dancers on the ground in front of Firo and says, lift your hands and command the dancers. And when Firo does that, they sway and lift in front of his hands. Like, it's the electric attraction, but it looks like magic. It just looks like, you know, he is somehow able to conjure this, make things move with his mind. And Misa says, imagine if we were doing this in a darkened temple sanctuary using thin ropes that cannot be seen. Imagine also some incense and smoke swirling about you so that you appear to be shrouded in mystery. Imagine the reaction of the crowd as you appear to command sparkling birds and butterflies made of thin foil to flutter about you without touching them. Which, honestly, low-key, I would like to see. That is some shit that they're like making it sound like, oh, we have some real antiquated effects. That sounds rad as hell, and I 100% hope that this sort of thing is still employed because that's really cool. I love that idea. I would love to see that. Like, this, it sort of made me wonder about, I don't know if anybody who listens to this ever got to see Cursed Child on stage, but Cursed Child is a really terrible play when you read it. Like, it's super bad. And I've heard a lot of people say that seeing it, they liked it much better because they thought that the effects on stage were really, really cool. Now, to me, that is inadequate. You can't have a garbage script, but then make it a bunch of amazing effects, and all of a sudden I've forgotten how bad the script is. However, I do wonder what they managed to pull off that was good enough that multiple people have told me they were willing to let it go because the effects were so good. And I wonder if they still do things like this, you know? So yeah, this dude says like the force was able to flow through Firo's body really effectively. A better way to channel and store the silkmotic charge would involve a suspended bar of metal, which we in the trade call a prime reservoir. And he says that, you know, doing the same thing as he did where he was rubbing the silk up and down a glass rod, that is super, super tedious and takes too long. So they use a generator. He moved another of the machines over to near one end of the rod. It consisted of a wooden stand on which a glass globe was mounted in such a way that it was free to revolve about an axle. Misa attached a small metal chain to one of the knobs at the end of the suspended iron bar and dangled the other end of the chain onto the globe. Then he handed a folded bundle of silk to Firo and started to rotate a crank to the side, making the globe spin. "Hold the silk against the glass, please," he said. Firo did so. The metal chain clanked gently against the spinning surface of the globe, sounding like rain striking a tiled roof. This is much more efficient for building the silkmotic force on the glass globe and transferring it to the prime reservoir. After he judged it to be sufficiently charged, Misa stopped the spinning globe. He went about the suite, extinguishing lamps, and then he says to Firo, "Try moving a hand near it." And Firo does, and just as his fingers are about to touch it, this spark leaps out. And then he says, "It bit me." And Misa's like, "Exactly. And not everything will cause it to discharge. You, as a human being, and metal are extremely conductive. Silk and glass don't seem to have any effect at all. And that's why we insulate things with glass or suspend stuff from silk ropes." And I just think this is really neat. So Firo asks some intelligent questions here. He says, "Is silk the only source?" "Not at all," said Misa. "Substantially the same effects may be achieved by rubbing amber with fur or leather against glass. Indeed, the combinations seem almost infinite." And Firo's like, "And is the power that they generate the same as this kind of power?" And Misa, I was starting to wonder, like, is he going to get real weird about how many questions Firo is asking? But he seems delighted to be able to talk about this freely with somebody that he doesn't worry about being competition for him. And he says that this is something that they all wondered, and all of their testing seems to point to the fact that the generated power is exactly the same, no matter what they use to create it. And then he mentions the best part of his show is when he cures people. I really rather loved this because for two reasons. One, I feel like electroshock therapy is something that we treat a lot of the time as this like incredibly dramatic, damaging sort of therapy. And granted, it can be like, that is something, any kind of therapy can be abused, right? And it can be overdone. A patient can be inadequately protected against it. But it is something that is still to this day used very successfully. And I feel like it's got this stigma around it that a lot of people don't really understand. And I liked that being brought up here and that this dude has managed to discover this part of its usefulness. And I also like Firo not really putting a ton of credence into that idea. Like for Firo, the very measurable, practical aspects of this are way more impressive and important to him than some theoretical like healing thing that he isn't really even convinced works. Like it says, many remedies seem to him mere superstition or just so stories. And I am absolutely that way. I used to be a big believer in like homeopathy and essential oils and stuff when I was like in my teens and 20s. And then as I began to get older and explore more about the literature behind it, I began to realize that everything that supports these things as being effective are written by people who have a vested interest in them being effective. There was nothing peer reviewed, in other words. There was very little to support any of the claims that they were making. And I sort of had to begin to let it go there's a point at which logic began to overtake the things that I had been taught by mostly my mom. And I began to just be like, no, I don't buy this. So Firo's reaction to this, like, we know now that indeed electroshock therapy can be used for a lot of these things. It's absolutely effective. But I do not blame Firo for reacting with deep skepticism, because pretending that you can heal ailments is like one of the oldest tricks in the book for con artists and snake oil salesmen. And this dude, he's claiming it works, but he's also calling it a show. So it doesn't really feel like this dude is particularly invested in whether it works or not. And I doubt he's doing follow-up appointments, you know? So I'm just interested in that being mentioned at all. And I wonder if it will come back and be part of the story again later. So this is when they get to the jar and him talking about the way that it stores the energy. Well, first, Firo goes downstairs, and it turns out that Rosanna is hiding in the room directly below the one that they are in. And she is listening in on the conversation, and she's also going to do a little bit of smoke work while they're in there. And she asks Firo, I really like Rosanna. She isn't as like fucking intense and forceful as Gia is. She doesn't have that kind of like ambition. But she loves her son so much. You can just like feel it in this scene. And she is so wanting to do the right thing. She is so good-hearted, you know? And she's asking him, like, does he really think that this is valuable? And I like that Firo is wise enough to be like, I think so. I have no idea how it is useful, but I bet if I get the information and bring it to Thera, she will figure out exactly how it's useful. That is a wise person who is able to be like, oh, no, I don't know anything about this. I'm not stupid enough to think that just because I don't get it, it's not useful or meaningful. I'll just bring this information to a person who is much smarter than me and let them figure it out. Good on you, buddy. You know, because there'd be plenty of people who are just like, how could you use that? You know, basically like the exact dude that Thera was dealing with in her chapter with the Garinifin carcasses, and he just didn't want to fucking hear her. Yeah. So he says, I have to get the information first. Magicians tend to guard their secrets jealously. This is why I asked for your help. She says, why not tell him who you are? He'll just want to help. And Firo's like, he will demand so much money. And the thing is, I believe that he genuinely wants to do something noble, but he is the sort of person who defaults to like their kind of shittier behavior. And so rather than like do the honorable thing and offer to help because it's the right thing to do, I bet he would just demand an enormous fee. Even patriots may be tempted by profit. It's expensive to run an empire, and I've learned a few things these last few years. So they order this a hot pot, which is basically a brazier with a clay pot, and they get raw ingredients that they cook together over this fire, which I have done. There was like a Korean steakhouse near me in Dallas, and I've gone to it. And let me tell you, kids, it looks so cool from the outside. And then once you actually are there, you just are so hungry and want your food cooked so bad. And you're just like, how long do I have to wait and stare at this chicken that is right there and yet I can't eat it? And then you finally do eat it, and like it might not be quite cooked or it might be overcooked, and that's all your fault. It's not great. I don't recommend it. I am like a really good cook, and I didn't even really enjoy it. So I just, it's the sort of thing that you do because you have interest in a gimmick. It's not because you actually want to have a good meal. And if you ever do have an opportunity to go to one of those things, I recommend going just for the experience of it, but make sure you eat before you go. Just make sure you don't go in there super hungry, because it's difficult to get full. It takes a long time and you're going to be impatient. So Firo is he purposefully spills onto the coals of this thing so that smoke appears. And that way, when his mother begins to send smoke into the room, it won't be noticeable. And he does this, and he asks Misa about the OJ jars, which is what Misa calls them. And he basically explains that they are batteries. That at first they were filled with seawater, but then he realized that all he needed was something that was like a channeling material inside. And he says that he still fills it with seawater for the effect in street performances, but it's not actually necessary. And it says Misa plugged the stopper back into the jar, making sure that the chain rested against the foil at the bottom. Then he spun the crank in the Silcomotic generator again to charge up the prime reservoir. Finally, he held the jar in his hand and brought the knob at the top close to the prime reservoir, generating a loud zap and bright sparks. Notice how the Silcomotic force from the prime reservoir flowed into the OJ jar. And Firo does it, and he holds just the sides or just the bottom. As long as he doesn't touch the top, it's fine. But Misa's like, all right, now try and touch the top and don't drop it. And he touches it, and Misa's ready and catches it, because inevitably Firo drops the jar, because the way the electricity works, it causes him to lose control of his hands. There is no way to continue holding it. And Firo feels like his heart pumping. It's clear that the electric shock had a real effect on him, and he has to sit down. And Misa says so many interesting tricks can be designed around the jar. The problem with the prime reservoir and the Silcomotic generator is that they're too bulky and too hard to operate in a discrete manner. Anyone can intuit the flow of the Silcomotic force, and though the sparks generated are pretty, the trick loses its effectiveness because the audience can see how it's done. With these jars, I can charge them up ahead of time away from the crowd, then bring them around with me. Because they look like ordinary jars, people don't suspect that they can pack such a punch, and they can hold a charge for days. And when Firo's like, did you invent these? He gets a little bit cagey. And he's like, all right, look, I did, but it wasn't me though. And he tells Firo about how he was at a real low point in his life, and his street performances were not going well. He was getting to the point that he was going to have to sell a bunch of his equipment in order to just eat. And that is the beginning of the end for a street performer, if you don't even have your equipment, And so he goes to a shrine for Roofizo and prays for help. And he says, I fell asleep and dreamed of a handsome young doctor who came to me and showed me the design of these novel jars. He explained that these Silcomotic devices could be used to treat various diseases, but they could also be used to perform magic tricks. He said that I could use them to get rich, but that I had to promise to help the people of Dara when such knowledge was needed. And Firo is just like, are you serious? This is, it doesn't get better than this, being able to be like, well, that thing that a god told you in a dream? I guess I'm part of your destiny. It does not get better than that. So the rest of the evening, Firo is just sitting with Misa and explaining and asking him a ton of questions. And it says the next morning, Misa was on a messenger airship bound for Ginpen. I am super duper flipped out by the way this paragraph ends right before that. How connecting 2 channeling rods from an OJ jar to the legs of a dead frog made them kick and swim. We're not gonna reanimate Garinafin corpses with electricity, are we? I really don't want that. I guess you can use them to, like, use the electricity to make some kind of wings go up and down, though. There's so many ways that this can be used. Like, I'm obviously kind of caught up in the concept of the, like a flying airship to go up against these dragons, but it doesn't necessarily have to center around that. So then there's like a break, and we go to this whole thing with Empress Gia. And it turns out that there is a locust problem, and they are swarming and eating so many of the crops. And locust plagues are normally taken care of by Imperial airships that miss the fields with pesticides, essentially. But the airships are out of commission at this point because of the war. So that is not something that they can be doing. And the people, understandably, feel like this is sort of a blow to the House of Dandelion overall. They seem to all be sort of under the impression that, like, this is happening because the gods don't like what we're doing. They've retracted their support. It's sort of the vibe that you get. And Gia is in front of the statues and like screaming at the gods, like, what the fuck do you want me to do? And the prime minister says every sign can be interpreted in multiple ways. The key is to come up with an interpretation you like. And Soto says, if you want to have a second act, this is the moment to seize the story. Such a good line. I love it so much. So basically, Gia decides to, like, low-key treat the locusts like the invaders and go out there and just fucking fight them, despite the fact that they are attacking and biting her back. The ministers and generals rushed over to protect her. The empress shoved them away. The people must eat, and I'll kill these mindless creatures one by one if that's what it takes. Some have mistaken my reticence as weakness. If the gods truly want the House of Dandelion to end, then let them kill me today in this field. I'm not going back. And they all begin to pick up shovels and things as well and come and fight them. It says, as they swatted at the endless living tide and bore the stinging pain, more than a few in the crowd thought they must have looked quite mad, but there was also a kind of frenzy in the joy of taking action, however symbolic, that made the crowd feel invincible. Gia no longer felt she was engaging in political theater. She felt bonded to the subjects around her as though the people of Dara were a single organism. She was buoyed by waves formed from their courage and rage. It was glorious to struggle against heaven and earth as a woman, as the Empress of Dara, as a member of the proud race descended from the Ano and the natives of these islands. Then, from all directions of the compass, flocks of birds approached. Ravens, gulls, starlings, magpies, doves, even falcons. Never had Dara seen such a large flock of birds of so many species flying in unison. They fell upon the locusts and devoured them. So, this is, of course, by most people, seen to be a miracle from the gods. And many, it says, they made many once again believe in the strength of the House of Dandelion, but Prime Minister Kogo Yelu carefully investigated the source of the locusts and wrote a secret report to the marshal. What is going on here? We go back to the marshal and Zomi and Thera, who are taking all of the reports that everybody is submitting. There are the ones from the laboratories that are talking about the carcasses and the way that they feed and the way that the fire, like the hydrogen is being used. There's the ones about the silcomotic force. And Kogoyelu had applied his expertise in evaluating novel inventions, and Firo, Thankaru Kono, and Pumayemu had vetted them with their own field experience. The marshal slammed her fist down on the table. She had a plan. I do not know what to think. He notes the source of the locusts and makes a note. What does that mean? How can that be useful? Do they somehow cause swarms to descend on the Liuku? They don't really have like crops growing or anything, do they? Oh, I guess they do, because he's in the field. That's how this next chapter opens, is Prince Timu in the field. Let's see. Yeah, maybe that's all it is just like eat their food supply. So the next chapter, when it begins, because we've talked about what happens at the end, but I didn't really talk about the discussion at the beginning. It says, Pekyu Tenryo sent emissaries to persuade Prince Timu every day. Many of the emissaries were Kashima, who had decided that it was easier to serve the Pekyu than to labor in the fields under the lash of the Liuku guards. The common people hated the collaborationists, which only pushed them closer to the Liuku overlords. This is part of Pekyu Tenryo's plan to control the conquered population by playing the elites off the common people and some elites against others. Guys, I know that that's just such a thing that we sort of take for granted is true. But oh my God, it's really like calculated and it's really fucked up. This is such a thing that happens still, you know? Like, you manage to pit people against false enemies so that they just don't even notice you. And it works like a fucking charm because people are so gullible. People are so easy to misdirect. It's really depressing. You know, it's like, especially nowadays with the way that social media has shortened our attention spans in a lot of ways, there is this like fatigue that we get at being mad at the same thing for any extended period of time. So we go through fads of like what cause we're going to be obsessing about today. And at the moment we're in the midst of like the Black Lives Matter. And I really am so terrified that that's going to like stop being something that people care about because they're going to be moving on to another thing. And it's, in my opinion, racial disparity in the United States is one of the foundational parts of what's wrong with the country and why things don't work. And I think we're addressing something that's like eating away at the heart of what we are supposed to be. But a lot of people see it as this like niche problem, and it's so not. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. That line just really killed me. Today's Kashima was named Awira Pin, a renowned incentivist from Dasu. And Timu basically is like not here for any of this. He is super used to having these debates, and he tells this guy that no one has to die if the Liuku stop killing. I am not responsible for them deciding to kill people. I can't be held to that sort of standard. The barbarians have only conquered 2 islands, and look at what they've done to the place. If we surrender, all of Dara will be reduced to this. And this dude is like, no, we're just in the middle of war. This isn't how it would be. If Pekyu Tenryo were Lord of Dara, the people would be his flock in charge, and he would love them as a proper shepherd. And he says, oh, so what you're saying is the people of Dara will be like valuable property, and he won't want to see his property damaged. In fact, he will need a good caretaker to watch over them. And Weira's thinking, sweet, he's totally on the track. I got him. And Timu's like, yeah, see, the thing is, we have never, ever forgotten. These people are not our property. And this is not something that we can give you. This capitulation, that ain't it, Chief, basically. And this is when we go to Tanvanaki discussing things with her father and how things worked out. And she goes and has what, when you don't know what happens later, seems like a pretty awesome debate with Timu. So let's see, where is it? He was surprised to see the Peku's daughter. She wasn't dressed in the crude fur and leather outfit. Instead, she was dressed like a woman of Dara. Silk robe, cloth shoes, wooden soles. Some of her hair pinned up in a bun with a jade hairpin. Timu realized the princess was very beautiful, though he had never applied that word to her in the past. And he calls her Your Highness, and she's like, yeah, can it, Your Highness. I know what you really fucking think of me. I know what you think of all my people. And she kind of like gets in his face and steps up close to him and grabs his face in her hands and moves it from side to side and appraises him like a fucking animal that she's trying to either sell or she's thinking of buying. And he starts to turn away from her. And she says, I told you to stand still. And he's like, come on, dude, really? You're going to just like be out here humiliating me and torturing me for just the funsies? Like, this is not an honorable way to treat a person. And she's like, oh, come on. That is not what's going on here. But you know what? Fine. Let me tease you then. Do you think I'm pretty? And he says, yes. And she asks, all right, I can tell you're not lying about that. Why do the men of Dara lie so much? And she says that they all think one thing and say another. Zata Ruthi thought that we were all barbarians, barely better than animals, yet he pretended to treat us as honored guests. The wealthy and powerful have even more money and power, yet they say they're trying to take care of the people. And she challenges Timu a couple of times because he's trying to say, like, you know, I am trying to, her question is, why do you watch your people starve? He's like, I'm trying to keep them from starving. You are the one who turned this into all of these, the fields that he's in are not crops. They're grazing pastures. That's what I forgot about, how that detail is in there. Okay. Yeah. The locusts can eat the Garinifin's food. Oh no. That's interesting. That'll really fuck him up. He says, my people can't drink Garinifin milk. It makes them sick. And she says, oh, so when you say people of these islands, you just mean your people, and you'd be happy to see my people starve. And he's like, I didn't ask you to come here. You guys could have stayed where you were and been okay. And she tells him, okay, how about this? And she explains what it's like back where she's from, what the landscape is like, the infighting, the fact that mothers have had to smother their children with their own two hands in order to be able to feed the ones that remain. And she's like, you do not know what it is like to go without. You don't know what it's like to live somewhere that doesn't even have enough to provide you with what you need. You were born in a place that is super fertile, and you don't have to think about what it means to just need to survive. And I have heard your history. I know what happened with Mapidere. I know about the Chrysanthemum Dandelion War and the way y'all slaughtered your people. thousands, outright executions, not even in battles. You do not get to say shit to us about us being barbarian or savage. Shut the fuck up. And he tries to be like, well, we live here and you're invading. And she says, oh, really? Because I'm pretty sure your ancestors stole this land from somebody else. And he says, well, but everybody you've enslaved was born here. And she's like, oh, that's how it works. Okay, so if I get pregnant and then give birth to a child, that child gets to call you an invader? And she keeps on like being like, every single standard that you have is invented. You are on the side of the person who stands to gain. And so you've created an argument that, if you don't poke at it, makes it seem like you guys are really the oppressed ones. I don't see it. And I think if you really look, you won't see it either. And he remembers something that Zomi said to him. Before birth, all of us are mere potentials. We have no control over the movement of an incarnation, when we might end up as the son of an emperor or the daughter of a peasant. The veil is lifted as we come into the world, and we find ourselves holding a box that determines our fate without regard to our merit. Yet all the great philosophers have always said that our souls are equal in the eyes of the world father. And he's realizing, like, that's basically what she's saying is, we just happen to be born in the wrong place. There is no particular reason why you deserve this and we don't. Trying to just say, well, we were here first, somebody else was here before you, and yet you guys didn't have a problem taking it then. Fuck you. Listen, she's not totally wrong. All right. And he eventually comes up with a compromise. But he doesn't, like, when he mentions it to her later, we don't get to hear what it is. And after she rapes him and gets him to sort of give up fighting, she says that that is something that is possible, but there will have to be a lot of bloodshed first. And that is all we hear of how that works. So that's that. I have to wrap. But oh God, guys, so it's an intense couple of chapters. Kyle says we're in the end game now. 3 episodes left. Wow, just 3. Shit. All right. Well, damn. I have no idea what to expect. All right, everybody. Well, thank you again so much for listening. Thank you to Kyle again for commissioning this episode. I hate you, but I do like this book. And I will be seeing you all again soon with a new episode. Until then. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.